The text for this morning's sermon is from Luke chapter 13, beginning at verse 10. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it to water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, Abraham Lincoln was our tallest president so far. And when you look at many of those Civil War era pictures, they show him towering over the generals who reported to him. I've sometimes wondered what it would be like to stand head and shoulders over others, to see the tops of their heads first, to have to look down to look someone in the eye. In my elementary school, our principal, Mr. Maynard, was about the same height as President Lincoln. He was 6'4", 6'5", and we students, of course, were all much shorter by comparison. And I can remember looking up at him in awe, tilting my head back all the way. His amazing height seemed somehow to add to his authority as principal. A few years ago, while we were visiting our daughter and her family in Rhode Island, I watched in amazement and with some amusement as our younger grandson Jack faced down his father. He was only about 2 years old at that time, and Jack was short for his age anyway. He was probably no more than 2 feet tall at the time, and our son-in-law is about 6'2", 6'3". And Daddy had just told Jack to stop shutting that bedroom door. Instead, Jack stood in the doorway, all 24 inches of him, and he defied his father, as 2-year-olds can do, screwing up his little face in anger and shouting at his daddy, "No!" And look up into his father's face. He didn't seem to know or to care that he was so much shorter. Our physical condition carries with it a perspective on the rest of the world. The unnamed woman in this morning's story had some type of handicapping condition. She was bent over. For 18 years she had been in that condition, we're told. Her posture must have looked as though she had the weight of the world holding her down. For 18 years her gaze had rested on the ground at her feet. There was no looking down on the tops of other people's heads for her. Maybe this woman came to recognize the people she met more by voice than by facial recognition. Or maybe she even recognized their feet first. It would have taken a great effort for her to look anyone in the eye. Luke tells us that it was the Sabbath and Jesus was teaching in a synagogue, this woman's synagogue. Listen again to verses 10 and 11. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand upright. Luke doesn't tell us that this woman went to worship in hopes of being healed. I imagine that worship may have been part of the discipline of her life. It may have been one of the things that had kept her going all those years through physical infirmity. Some translations describe her physical condition as a spirit of infirmity. That language may sound very odd to us 21st century people. When I am ill or injured, though, I still have a sense that I am not my illness or my injury. I don't want to be known as the case of heart disease in the room 2 doors down from the nursing station. I do not want to be known by my diagnosis, because I am still myself through it all, but I am afflicted with an infirmity that is somehow foreign to me. Jesus looked at this woman from across the room and saw a daughter of Abraham, someone who was more than her physical affliction. In verse 12 we read, when Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." According to Luke's gospel, this was Jesus' last visit to a synagogue on his journey to Good Friday and the cross. And on that Sabbath, in that holy time and place, 2 paths crossed. And a daughter of Abraham was freed from a long-standing physical affliction that must have profoundly affected her social life. Luke tells us when Jesus laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. We don't know how this healing affected the woman's life going forward, but in that moment, as she was suddenly able to stand up straight and look her neighbors in the eye, she began to praise God. A change that drastic can prove to be disruptive in the society to which a person belongs. We have heard of cases where a person lost a great deal of weight, and rather than rejoicing at that change in their loved one's situation, family members begin doing little things to sabotage the new way of life for their loved one. Change, even good change, can be disruptive. It reorders the furniture of our lives, whether we like it or not. We are told in verse 14 of our text that the leader, or probably the president of that congregation, was in fact offended by Jesus' behavior. It says, but the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days to be cured, and not on the Sabbath. The rabbis of that day taught that it was acceptable in order to save a life to take any necessary action on the Sabbath, but a situation which was not life-threatening, that was a very different situation as far as this congregational leader was concerned. And so the moment of joy at the healing quickly passes, and conflict erupts in that congregation. Most of us prefer to avoid conflict and disruption in our worship experience. In fact, if we're honest, we probably come to worship to experience a kind of oasis of calm and predictability at the end of a week that might have been more than crazy for us. Rhonda and I, when we were in college at the University of Redlands, attended First Baptist Church of Redlands regularly, and I remember one Sunday, shortly after the new pastor had arrived, one of the college students who sang in the church choir quickly stepped out of the choir loft and into the pulpit, and she began to give the congregation a long talking to. We would call it a rant, I think. And it went on for some time, and people looked embarrassed at this disruption to the order of worship, but they weren't quite sure what to do. And finally, some kind and brave member managed to usher her back to her seat. but worship had been disrupted that day. That young lady's contribution had not been in the order of worship. Like Jesus' healing of the bent-over woman in the synagogue, it was not part of the official plan for the day. Well, I remember that on the following Sunday at First Baptist Redlands, the new pastor stood up to speak, and he faced the choir, and he said, "I'll make you a deal. You don't preach sermons and I won't sing." And of course, that was an attempt to lighten things up, but it was also a clear warning, no more disruptions like we saw last week. Do we come, I wonder, to worship on a Sunday morning hoping for predictability, when so much of our lives outside of church may be out of our control? We tell each other that we should be open to God's Spirit doing a new thing in our midst, but do we sometimes secretly hope that there will be no disruption, no change? Jesus calls this unnamed woman in the story a daughter of Abraham. "Woman, you are freed of your infirmity," he said. In fact, Jesus tied her need for freedom with the very meaning of Sabbath itself. In his book titled The Sabbath, Rabbi Abraham Heschel wrote, "The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath we try to become attuned to holiness in time." Rabbi Heschel went on to note that the ancient rabbis believed that the Sabbath was given to people, not people to the Sabbath. There was nothing more important, according to the Torah, than to preserve human life. Even when there is the slightest possibility that a life may be at stake, one may disregard every prohibition of the law. The book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament ties the very meaning of Sabbath to release from bondage. In chapter 5 we read, "But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter," so forth. And then in verse 15 it says, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." Sabbath and release from bondage go hand in hand. How should we properly honor God in a Sabbath mentality? In verse 16, Jesus interpreted his own disruptive behavior, this lifting of the burden from the woman's back, as something more than a healing. It was actually a release from bondage. He said, "And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" What could be more fitting? The leader of that congregation seemed to be saying, "You can come back some other day of the week for healing, but we know that no other day is given to any one of us but today." Jesus would never pass that way again. His path would not cross the path of that woman again, that daughter of Abraham. Today was the day to bring freedom to her life. Now was the time. It is unfortunate that what should have been a joyous event, something that could be celebrated by the whole community, so quickly became the source of division and polarization. We're told in verse 17, when Jesus said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing in all the wonderful things that he was doing. Those who opposed Jesus that day were publicly put to shame, while others rejoiced. In our country today, we understand all too well the meaning of polarization and taking sides. And I think we should be careful about piling on to Jesus' opponents in this story. In their own way, weren't they also bent over men and women, people who could not easily lift their eyes from their pavement to look heavenwards? I'm convinced that Jesus did not intend to heap shame upon them. I believe that he was inviting them too to stand up straight and look heavenward and to look one another in the eye, to hear the words from Deuteronomy again, "You were a slave in the land of Egypt, therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." Jesus was inviting everyone in that congregation that day to experience the Sabbath as a day and a holy time that brings freedom. I wonder, can we hear his invitation to each one of us today? Come and be set free. Cast off the burden that weighs you down and stand tall before God as the son or daughter of Abraham that you are meant to be. Open your eyes and your hearts to the new thing that God wants to do in your life.